Back tonight at Beyond in Focus, President Cyril Ramaphosa will be attending the 14th Brics Summit starting on Thursday in Beijing, China. Chinese President Xi Jinping will chair the summit under the theme Foster High-Quality Brics Partnership, usher in new era for global development. The summit is expected to send a clear signal of solidarity and cooperation among the trade partners Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa. Joining us now to discuss what Pretoria can benefit from closer Brics association is Africa and regional analyst Gideon Chitanga. Gideon, good evening. Good to have you with us. What is South Africa going to say at the 14th summit of Brics that Brics would want to listen to? Have we been a good partner to Brics, at least in the last 12 years?
Yes, I think so. I think that the relations within Brics are great. The sense that these are countries which share common values and have an interest as developing countries to continue to stimulate the sluggish economic development that is emanating from the impact of the COVID. So I think that the main issue will definitely be post-COVID recovery or just COVID recovery, because we don't know if we have come out of COVID, and how to stimulate economic development in the 5 member countries. We know that South Africa secured a 2 billion loan from the Emergence Fund of the New Development Bank to at least drive its economy, which was already affected. So I expect that there will be a bigger conversation about funding more expanded financing into the economies of all the 5 countries in various sectors, from infrastructure to agriculture to technology development and so on, to create new opportunities, employment opportunities, boost production, modernize economies, so that the living conditions of the citizens of these countries can be improved. The second major issue, obviously, is the ramifications of the conflict in Ukraine, and Russia being a member of the Brics. Surely the other brother countries would like to erase some of the concerns that are emerging, particularly the issue of the food security. I think that Brics offers a better platform to discuss this issue without the baggage of our Western interests, and probably to explore ways in which African countries which are affected or really concerned with the issues around food can be assisted.
Yeah. What, or at least some of the key pillars in this cooperation include an increased access to each other's markets, but also to promote mutual trade and investment. And a lot of people immediately, when they heard the president in his weekly edition of the newsletter saying South Africa's South Africa has substantially grown its relationship within Brics in the last 12 years. They asked him, so why have you not asked them to bring us oil in this dire economic time?
Yes, I actually think that South Africa is a very important country and is in a very strategic space within the Brics, and the benefits are many and they're at different levels. At economic level, of course, Brics is a fairly very young institution. It started off as an informal entity, and over time it is institutionalizing. There's a lot of different levels of strategic engagement at the levels of the heads of states, at multi-sectoral level, where you get experts and ministers. There's a lot of focus on research. But if you were to ask what is the major achievement or the main benefits to each member state, I would point out the New Development Bank as a major major benefit, major breakthrough. South Africa, as one of the 5 members, owns 1/5 of the bank. Each member has a 1/5 share. Decision making is based on consensus. The New Development Bank funds a lot of infrastructure development in all these countries, but the main countries which are benefiting a lot are developing countries, which are always the African countries, and South Africa specifically is sitting at the top of the table in the sense that we always struggle to get funding. And with that background, you have to understand that the general main funding before the Brics, before the formation of the new development bank, came from the IMF and the International Monetary Fund. And such funding came with a lot of conditionality. As we speak, there's a big debate here in South Africa as to whether South Africa should get loans from the IMF and in what quantities and what would be the ramifications. What we know is funding that is provided by the new development bank within the framework of the Brics comes without conditionalities. It's quite, the funding is released very efficiently, and the focus is mainly infrastructure development, but generally in a broad sense, sustainable development. So this is a kind of funding that was initiated by developing countries, which is more responsive to the needs of these developing countries. The other thing is, you would know that in 2018, Deloitte produced a report which indicated that after joining the Brics, trade between South Africa and India trebled. Trade between South Africa and China trebled. And at the moment, China is one of the biggest trading partners with South Africa. There's a lot of diversified capital flows that are coming into South Africa, and South Africa is increasingly exporting to China. If you consider Brics as a collective, we are talking about 47% of the global population as a market. So you can say that South Africa has a huge market at its disposal. We are talking about 37% global world GDP. We're talking about 17% of our global trade. We're talking about US. We are talking about 4 trillion in forex deposits, in forex reserves, in US dollar terms. So as a collective, there is huge potential. There's a certain level of benefits. I think that considering that Brics is still a very young institution, it's institutionalizing, there is room for developing countries to address their interest within their frameworks at the minimal cost of external pressure from the global north.
Now, when we look at our exposure, for example, to Brics, it's quantified at 25.5 billion rands currently, if I'm correct, compared to what we are currently owing the World Bank or, for example, the IMF. Is that an indication that we are less dependent on funding from Western nations?
So at the moment, I think the issue is less about dependence than having an alternative that is quickly accessible and more responsive to South Africa or to the concerned Brics members. I think the common view is that the African Development Bank and the Brics is not necessarily a competitor, but this is an alternative which provides the 5 member countries and broadly as a geopolitical platform in the global south, a more responsive platform and institutional framework, which we hope in the long run can cut off the dependence that you mentioned, and these countries can depend on their agents, on their resources to sustain themselves. Other avenues of capital and support and interventions will always be there, but I think it's great that we are having developing countries trying and learning to look after themselves. And this could be a political point more than an economic point, but as a starting point, I think it makes a big difference.
Yeah. What difference will that make? I mean, that's the question. Our continued involvement in our economic recovery, what difference will that make? For example, maybe the kinds of loans that we require going forward, will they be able to shoulder that economic alliance? Would it be able to yield some useful business ventures? How can it assist our economy?
I think the most important aspect is that so we are able to define our needs, what we urgently need. I'll give you an example. A lot of African countries find huge difficulties in securing funding, specifically for infrastructure development, building roads, for example, from the IMF or the International Monetary Fund. The second aspect is that when such funding is unlocked, it always comes with very difficult packages, some of which we generally call them conditionalities, which could be politics, governance, and so on, but some of which are extremely intrusive and not user-friendly and in some cases, people cannot wait for a long period to build a road that is urgently needed to be used today. Under these circumstances, we can go to the New Development Bank. It's our bank. We already have a 1/5 share. It's unlike the other institutions which are owned by other international actors, and present our case. And what I understand is that the New Development Bank is trying to be as much as possible more user-friendly, more flexible, more proactive in addressing critical interests, not just dishing out money, but addressing critical interests in a manner that is quite responsive to the interests of these developing countries, which is clearly different from the politics and the policy constraints and the ideational constraints that you find when you are dealing with the key institutions of the Bretton Woods. And maybe to go back to this point, a combination of the 2008 global crisis, as well as these difficulties with the IMF and the World Bank, were the key drivers in the formation of Brics. And that the key leaders in the 5 countries that we are discussing agreed to launch a financial institution. I think this is something that is unprecedented. It's a very critical phase of developing countries trying to mobilize their own capacities, financial capacities, economic capacities, and technical skills to address their own domestic or internal problems, if you like.
Yeah. Having adopted a stance of neutrality in the Russia-Ukraine war, do you think the BRICS partners are entirely comfortable with that position that South Africa is taking? I mean, if you look at China, they're described as pro-Russia neutrality, really, if you look at it. Well, South Africa is trying to play a balancing act.
You know, I think the world is concerned with the conflict in Ukraine. What is different is how the different parties are looking at addressing the problem. Obviously, meeting in a diplomatic platform like the BRICS, the conversation takes a different tone, but that does not detract from the fact that these conversations have to be honest. So the West sees this conflict from the perspective of their own interests, including geopolitical interests in Ukraine and against Russia, and they've taken a policy of sanctions, deterrence, and arming Ukraine, which is conflictual. In their view, that's how they have to deal with the conflict. And Russia sees that as Western aggression. The rest of the global South, they are quite edgy or nervous, if you like, where issues concerns Western aggression, because this is what they know the West to do, to resort to military conflict when there are issues. And they are offering diplomacy as an alternative. I believe that either way, the conflict in Ukraine will have to be dealt with diplomatically. And possibly China, South Africa, and the other parties that are involved could play a critical role in addressing some of the problems that we already see, but also as global partners in bringing to a table a peaceful resolution to the conflict.
African regional analyst Gideon Chitanga, appreciate your time and thank you very much for joining us tonight here on In Focus.